Right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be back at Mardi Gras again. Fourth, fifth year, sixth year in a row that I've been here at Mardi Gras, and every year I've got to say it's probably my favourite international festival that's held in Nimbin. I'd like to acknowledge we're meeting on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to those elders past and present. And in fact, as you travel in and you travel out and you spend time in Nimbin, you do get a sense of the deep history of this place, don't you? And you get a sense of the very short time that our culture has been on this continent and the damage we've done in just 230 years. And you get a sense of the deep wisdom and the understanding and the knowledge of First Nations peoples. And I think all of us have a collective obligation to do a great deal more to drive a just compact with the First Nations peoples of this country. And we're talking about police and police powers. And if ever there's a point to talk about justice for Aboriginal people, it's right here, right now, about police and police powers. So I acknowledge elders past, present, and those emerging ones that I think are doing an amazing job as First Nations peoples in this country. So there's a little summary about what this little talk will be about. We're going to be going through some of the safeguards, to the extent there are safeguards, kind of legislative protections in the law. We'll do a little bit about your rights with police and do's and don'ts, what they can and can't do. When do you have to answer questions? You know, a lot of you guys are really sweet. You volunteer a whole lot of information to police, but we'll address whether that's rational or necessary. When you can be searched, when you can be arrested, when you can be fined, we'll run through that. There's been a bunch of anti-protest laws. Many people want to ask about what that actually means. We'll do some of that. And then we'll end up on some of the pretend accountability measures that the New South Wales government has put in, including body-worn cameras and a slight improvement we've got in police oversight. So look, just to start off, when you interact with police, it's a good idea once the interaction ends, particularly if it hasn't gone well, you just take some notes. And one of the best ways of taking notes is you just tap it out in your phone. Send yourself a text message, send yourself an email, put it on your notes. Just text out what happened if it didn't go well. You know, the officer said words to the effect, "Bugger off, you dickhead." I said words to the effect, "That wasn't very nice." Put it down, record it. The other thing is, it's legal to film the police. It's not legal to stick a phone 2 inches away from the police officer's face or to do it as a mate when somebody else has been questioned or interrogated or arrested by police. You can't interfere with the police. But if you're on a public street, you're in your house, you're on a footpath, and you see an ugly interaction occurring, you are well within your rights to stand a reasonable distance back, 4 or 5 metres back, get out your phone and film it. And in fact, I was having this discussion with a cinematographer about a couple of months ago, and they said, you know what, it's actually perfect if you're about 5 or 6 metres back, because then you've got a nice context about what's happening. So don't get right up close, don't interfere with what the police are doing, but you are well within your rights to photograph and film the police as they go about their business. And that includes if they're monstering one of your friends or not. Perfectly within your rights. And if a police officer comes up and says, "Stop filming," simply say to them, "I'm well within my rights, I'm not interfering with what you're doing. And you know because the police commissioner gave you a direction and told you that I'm within my rights." If you think a request or direction is unfair and the police are behaving badly, here's a good tip: don't swear, don't get aggressive. Just hold your temper. Be calm and ask, is it an offence if I don't do this? Are you saying I must do this? Is it an offence if I don't answer? And consider not answering. Unless you've got a lawyer, or unless they tell you if you don't answer, we're going to arrest you. So, your rights with police was a pretty grand title for particularly given we live in New South Wales and you have bugger all rights. We have no constitutional rights, right? There's no state constitutional rights that you can rely upon that give you some kind of liberty in the face of police actions. There's no fundamentally underlying principle of liberty that you can point to in a state constitution, and there's none in our federal constitution. We're about the only advanced liberal democracy, well, I say advanced, we're about the only liberal democracy in the world that doesn't have fundamental rights at either a state or a federal level. Cross the border and you go into the ACT, they've got a Charter of Rights. Cross the border, go into Victoria, they have a Charter of Rights. New South Wales, it's pretty much a rights-free zone. But there are some protections, or more accurately, some limitations on police powers in the key piece of legislation that police use as they go about their business, which is the Law Enforcement Powers and Responsibility Act. Also, most lawyers who deal with the police and criminal law will just simply call that LEPRA, Law Enforcement Powers and Responsibilities Act. It's called LEPRA. LEPRA empowers police and limits police all at once. So here's just some basic safeguards. If police are exercising powers, they have to provide some information. The statute says they do. So if police are going to be giving warnings or giving directions or requirements or requests that need to be complied with, they have to tell you why. They have to make it clear before they exercise their powers that they're about to exercise their powers, and they should provide their name. They don't always provide their name. But if they're going to issue a move on direction against you because they think you're behaving like a pork chop in public, they have to tell you that. You're behaving badly, you're causing public disorder, that's why I'm issuing you with a move on direction. There's some basic information. I'll deal with that in slightly more detail in a bit. So this is a good starting point, I think, if we're going to sort of get into the nuts and bolts. Do you have to give your name and address to police? Most people, even those people who are wary about police, think that if a police officer stops you in the street and says, "What's your name? Where are you from? Show me some ID," most people just do. They just simply say, "Hi, I'm David Shoebridge, Edgecliff Road. Here's my driver's licence." It's just, we pretend to be this anti-authoritarian, rugged convict history. We stand up to authority. It's bullshit. Australians are the most compliant, complicit with authority people that you're going to run into. And if police say to you, "What's your name? Show me some ID," almost everybody does. Almost everybody does. But you don't have to, and I'd recommend you don't. You only have to give the police your name. If you're stopped and you're driving a car, then you do have to provide your name and you do have to provide your licence. So if you're driving a car, you do. But if you're just walking down the street, you don't. I'll get to your question just after this. If you're under 18 and you're drinking alcohol in a public place and the police stop you, then you do have to give your name. You don't have to give ID, but you do have to give your name. And if the police suspect you of being involved in a crime, or the witness of a serious crime, then you have to give your name and details. But if you're just minding your own business, you've been to the pub, you've had a few drinks, you're walking down the street to home, police stop you and say, "What's your name? Show us some ID," you don't have to comply. In fact, you don't have to give them your name or ID at all. Yep, question. No, passengers don't have to give their details. Front seat passengers, back seat passengers don't have to say who you are, don't have to give ID, just the driver. And the only purpose of that law is for the police to ensure that drivers are licensed. It's not a criminal investigation entree. It's just to see if the driver is licensed. So can I just stress this? If you're walking down the street and the police stop you and ask you for your name and your ID, you don't have to give it to them. And the simple answer is, do I have to give you my name and ID? Are you saying I'm lawfully obliged to? They will say no, and you say, "Well, thanks very much." Keep walking. You don't have to stop. You don't have to stop unless they think they've got a reason to search you or detain you. Police don't have a right to just stop you in the street and keep asking you questions. Say, "Look, I'm very busy. I don't wish to stay here answering your questions anymore. I'm going home. I've got some peas to boil. It'd be lovely to talk to you, but peas are calling." Be polite, but it is about time we started exercising our rights and started ensuring that the police only exercise their powers when they genuinely have a reason to do so. But there's nothing ever to stop police making a request. They can always ask for your name. They can always ask for your ID. And they've got a habit of doing it in a way with so much authority that you feel like you have to comply. And that's the trick, I've got to say, that many police learn in the academy and then they learn it from their fellow officers, how to get people to give information when they're not legally obliged to. So, do I have to answer questions? Well, we have a qualified right to silence in New South Wales. There is a qualified right to silence. I've told you the circumstances in which you have to give personal details. If they arrest you, if they charge you, if you drive in a car, if you're a witness to a significant crime, or you're under 18 and you're drinking in a public place, then you've got to give your name, you've got to give some ID as well in those circumstances. But otherwise, you don't. You have a limited right to silence. You do not have to answer police questions about why you're where you are, where you're going, where you're intending to go. You don't have to answer any of those questions, whether they arrest you or not. And it is unlawful for the police to arrest you for the purpose of asking you questions. They can only arrest you if they suspect on reasonable grounds that you've committed an offence. They can't just arrest you to ask you questions or detain you to ask you questions. That's unlawful. If you do get arrested though, and you have a lawyer present with you, and the police ask you questions to which you have an answer and you choose not to answer, and you've got a lawyer there with you telling you not to answer, and then at a later point you wished you had answered that question and given certain details because it helps explain what happens, the police can actually, the law's been changed now so that the police in court can say, well, you didn't answer that in the first time we asked you, you only answered it the second time we asked you, we think you're making it up. But don't worry about that, because that problem only occurs if you're being questioned with a lawyer. If you're being questioned and you've got no lawyer present, you have a complete right to silence, apart from your name and your address details. So I want to emphasise that. If you're being questioned in the absence of a lawyer, even if you've been arrested, apart from giving your name and address, you have no obligation to answer the police questions. You do have a right to silence. Yes? Okay. Well, I can repeat the question. Do they have reasonable grounds to arrest you just because you have a peculiar response to showing your ID? Well, no. I mean, you do have to show your ID if you're driving, and if you don't show your ID if you're driving, they can then arrest you for that offence of not showing your ID. But, you know, slowly pulling out your wallet is not a reason to arrest you. Not having ID on you is not unlawful either. You're not compelled to have ID on you. So that wouldn't be a proper basis to arrest you. A really good question to ask the police is that one down the bottom. Will I commit an offence if I don't answer? And if they say no, you say, well, that answers it. Thanks very much. But before I go off on this, if you don't answer the first time, they'll ask you the second time and the third time and the fourth time and the fifth time, the sixth time and the seventh time, and you will feel like you're being battered down, and most people give in. It's really easy to say nothing, and I recommend you do. So, when can they search? They can't just search you if they don't like the look of you, all right? They can't just search you if you look Aboriginal. Although, you know, reality is they do. They can't just search you if you look like you might be at Mardi Gras. The reality is they kind of do, but they're meant to have a reasonable suspicion. And they're meant to have a reasonable suspicion that you've got either something stolen or illegally obtained upon you, or things that may be used illegally. So if you're walking in the middle of the night and you've got a jemmy on your shoulder and you're heading down a residential street, that's probably a pretty good basis for them to have reasonable suspicion to arrest you and search you. You may be about to commit the offence of break and entering. But they can't just search you unless they have that reasonable suspicion. A drug dog indication, for example. You're walking down the street and a drug dog indicates that you may have drugs upon you. Is that a reasonable basis to search you? What do people think? No? Well, they can search you if they have a warrant. No questions about that. So if they've gone to the magistrate and said, we think Joe Bloggs is running a meth lab, here's the reasons why, they can come and search you and search your premises. But a drug dog. So you're walking along, minding your own business, and a drug dog just stops next to you and indicates in its own peculiar drug dog way that you have drugs upon you. Well, it's an interesting point that, and it hasn't been 100% tested. Because drug dogs, as we know, get it wrong 60 to 70 to 80% of the time, depending on the police command. So if a drug dog is going to be wrong 80% of the time or 70% of the time, is that a reasonable basis to search? The police kind of know it's not. They kind of know it's not. They don't quite admit it's not. And the police have actually changed their standard operating procedures when it comes to drug dogs to say they no longer rely solely on the drug dog indication. They also rely upon a variety of other indicia that they're not going to tell us about that help form that reasonable belief that you have drugs upon you at that time. Maybe you're young. Maybe you're catching public transport. Maybe you're at a place that the police believe that a significant amount of drugs are doing. And they say they put all of that together with the drug dog indication to form the reasonable suspicion that you have drugs. I think that's bullshit. I think it's time it was tested in court. But that's a serious challenge. Yes?
Last week, I believe in the village, they brought some dogs through, and the dogs, I understood there were 24 searches and 7 arrests. So that's pretty low odds. And people who weren't carrying anything were humiliated and searched in public. And someone said to me later, I don't know the truth of it, but they said they had a warrant to do the street with the dogs.
Yeah, so the warrant allows them to use the drug dogs just going up and down the street. So the way the law works with drug dogs in New South Wales is drug dogs can operate, as like a sieve, just checking the general public to see whether or not they think they've got drugs on them in a really gross attack on our civil liberties. They can operate that way at a licensed premise, so at a pub or somewhere that sells alcohol. They can operate that way on public transport, but you're in Nimbin, so you've got bugger all public transport. But that's mainly the buses and the rail networks in our big cities and towns. And they can operate that way in certain streets of Sydney, like George Street of Sydney, King's Cross in Sydney, main streets of Sydney. But they can't just run a drug dog up and down the streets of Nimbin unless they have a warrant. Unless they go to a magistrate and say, well, we have super secret intelligence that suggests there may be a fair amount of cannabis in Nimbin, and for that reason we want a warrant to allow our drug dogs to operate, and they have to be given a specific warrant. And so that's what would have happened in that case. But again, you're going up and down Nimbin with drug dogs. If you randomly took 24 people off the street in Nimbin, there might be a chance you'd find 7 of them with cannabis. They have the amazing benefit of drug dogs, and they still manage to take 7 out of 24 with cannabis in Nimbin. It's not a useful tool. The police will often say, they had a 40% or 30% success rate when they've searched people following a drug dog indication at a music festival. Well, again, if you randomly pulled out 40 people out of the line at a music festival, you'd probably do better than the dogs do. There's a huge amount of evidence to suggest that the dogs respond actually more to handler bias than they do to the actual presence of drugs. Dogs are a pack animal. They see their handler as the leader of the pack. They know the kind of people that the leader of the pack responds to well when they're indicated to have drugs. So when they indicate a young person with dreadlocks, they know that they're going to have a positive subconscious response from their handler who says, great, well done, dog, that's the kind of person we want to search. And even if it's not expressed, that subconscious bias has been shown in a whole series of controlled studies with drug dogs to actually be more important to the dog than the presence of drugs or not. And for one of the many reasons I particularly loathe that drug dog program. They can't just search your car unless they've got a warrant or unless they have reasonable suspicion you have something in your car. So if they stop you, they breath test you, they can't just say, okay, now get out, we're going to search the car. They have to have a suspicion, and they may say that the car smelled like cannabis and for that reason I decided to search the car. Maybe that is reasonable suspicion, but they can't do it unless they have some serious indication, some reasonable suspicion about the search. And you should not consent to having your car searched. And you should not consent to a search of your person. And this is important. If the police stop you and they say, right, thanks very much, drug dog or not. There's drug dog or not. They stop you and say, okay, I want you to empty out your pockets, show me what's in your backpack. And they do that. You say, well, I'd rather not, thanks. Am I legally obliged to show you what's in my backpack and my pockets? And unless they've got reasonable suspicion, the police will say, oh, actually, no, you're not. Worth a try, though. Question at the back.
Yeah? Oh. We're on the way to Confest, and they have a roadblock, and they had the drug dogs, and so we pulled over, and the dog suspected there was something in the car, which we didn't have anything in the car anyway. And so the dog was reacting probably 4 or 5 times to something in the car. Mm-hmm. So they made us stand in the sun for about an hour, ripped all our personal belongings apart, the whole car, to the fact that they wanted to rip the dashboard basically apart, and there was nothing in the car. We didn't get an apology. We got nothing. We had to unpack all our suitcases, our packs, everything. There was nothing in the car, and they just no apology, no helping, no rights, no explanation. They made us stand in the stinking hot sun for about an hour while they searched our car.
Yeah.
It was pretty bad.
Well, I say again, we're not overburdened with rights in New South Wales or Australia. And so there's no, for example, no constitutional right against unlawful search like they have in the United States, no due process rights that we have in New South Wales. But if you challenge that, they'd have to prove they had a reasonable suspicion for the commencement of the search, and they'd say the drug dog indication was reasonable suspicion. I mean, if you were a person of substantial means, you may well want to take them to court on an alleged unlawful use of police, unlawful detention, unlawful use of police powers, because a drug dog indication is not a reasonable basis to form a suspicion. Most of us don't have the money or the power to challenge police in those circumstances. They're not allowed to damage your property. They're not allowed to damage your car. They're not allowed to pull the dashboard apart. But they can just detain you whilst they undertake a search of you or your car for a reasonable period of time if they have a reasonable suspicion.
But if you don't say you're going to Confest, they basically don't stop you. But because you're going to Confest...
Well, you don't have to tell the police where you're going. Don't tell them where you're going. Yeah, exactly. Don't lie to them, but you don't have to tell them where you're going. So I'd rather not tell you. Thanks very much. A couple of questions here. Yep.
Yes, see, what you're saying is good to know your rights, but when you're pulled up by a bad pig there at midnight on a lonely road, you say, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags empty, sir, and you get the hell home to your kids. When you pull this on the police, you make sure you've got an audience. You make sure there's a camera. You make sure someone's got their phone out and videoing this. The police will lie like shit, and the police know that they have to cover themselves within these grounds. So they'll say, yeah, he looks suspicious. Yes, we did smell weed.
Yep.
And they will damage your property. They will damage you. It's like sitting in jail prior to a court case, like Mulloway's doing at the moment. It's silly. We live in a very bad system.
Yeah, you make a really good point. It's a really disempowering moment for you. You're just a mug punter, minding your own business, and somebody pulls you over with all the power of the state behind them. They're heavily armed, they've got capsicum spray and tasers and firearms, and they've got all that authority. And if you're a single person by yourself, caught out with police late at night, all of those considerations, I think they're all very fair considerations to take into account. And I would urge you, if you're being stopped by police, you think that there's, you get a sense it's probably not going to go particularly well or it's unfair, if you've got a passenger in the vehicle, get them to start recording. At a respectful distance, they're entitled to do it. It's your vehicle, it's their phone. Get them to start doing it. And don't consent to searches. If the police say, I'm now directing you to get out of the car so I can search it, you say, am I compelled to do that? By all means do it. But if they say, can I search your car? A good answer would be no. And then they will say, well, I'm directing you to get out because I'm now going to search your car. And you say, well, am I obliged to? Yes. Don't volunteer. Yes, a couple of questions here and then I'll move on.
Yes, a big one is, what about with your smartphone? Have they got the right to not only look at it, but get your passcode and look through it? It happened to me with Commonwealth Police coming in from overseas.
Really simple answer to that, no. Unless they've got a warrant, don't touch my phone.
Really?
Unless they've got a direct order from a judge, don't hand over your password. Yeah, do not unlock your phone. In fact, if you're in a situation and police are coming to get your phone, lock it. That would be my advice. Yeah. But if the police say, right, show me your phone, hand it over your phone. All right, what's your passcode? That's how the interaction normally happens. Right, smartass, give me your phone. Show me, what's your passcode? Unlock his phone for me. And people just do. I'm telling you, don't. But it's, the question, the point that was raised there is it's a really disempowering moment. And most of us just comply. This is about what your rights are. It's not actually going to make that moment of interaction easier. It's a crap moment. I will come back to yep. Yeah. Oh yeah. I got to say, for all the laws and things we have, this is the single best police accountability tool I know of. Well, for accountability, it's better than a gun, but I'm a peace and non-violence politician, I would say that. So what can they do if they search you? If they stop you, a drug dog has indicated you've got drugs on you, what can they actually do? Well, the first thing is, if you're in public, they can't get you to strip down. They can get you, if you've got an overcoat on or a jacket on, they can get you to take an overcoat or a jacket off. If you've got a hat on, they can get you to take a hat off. They can run their fingers through your hair and they can get you to open your mouth and look in your mouth. And they can pat you down and search in all your pockets. They can get you to take gloves off. But they can't get you to start disrobing in public. And if they haven't found anything there and then, that's the end of the search. That's pretty humiliating. You're in public, surrounded by your peers, bunch of police. That's a crap moment. We've managed to reduce the number of searches following a drug dog indication in New South Wales by about half since we started our sniff-off campaign in about 4 years ago. So it was at about 16,000, 17,000 searches. It's now at about 8,000 or 9,000 searches a year. So we've had some success. Happy days. If you're not following sniff-off, I recommend you do. That's been a good program. But even with that, 500, 600, 700 times a year, the search will escalate to a strip search. And the police will say, well, I didn't find anything in the pat down, but I still think you've got drugs on you. So I'm going to take you off and do a strip search. That has to be in private and it needs to be done. The law is binary. It says it needs to be done by a police officer of your same gender. But you should assert what your gender is, what your preferred gender of the officer is to search you, and you should only be searched by that officer. But once they strip search you, it's a super indignant moment of, absolute disempowerment. You've got to take all your clothes off. They can have a look around you. They're not allowed to poke and prod. They're not allowed to get you to bend over so they can peer up your backside, although they do try that. They actually do try that. But they're not allowed to do that. You take your clothes off, they can have a look at you, but they're not allowed to put their hands upon you and or get you to bend over and humiliate you in that way. But I've heard time and time again that they do. They get you to squat, they get you to bend. You're not obliged to follow those kinds of rules and indignities. But again, I tell you this, but just picture this, right? You've already been searched on the street, you've already been pulled over by the police, you've been dragged into a room where there's you and, maybe one male, 2 male police officers for me, or maybe 1 or 2 female police officers if you're a woman, and you're naked, and they're exercising authority over you and they tell you to bend over. It just happens. You're in a shit situation, but you don't have to. I'm giving you what your rights are. I think we've gone through the arrest powers. They can't just arrest you because they don't like the look of you. They have to reasonably suspect that you've committed an offence or you're about to, or they have a warrant. That's pretty much the only occasions they can arrest you. And once they arrest you, they have to tell you why you're being arrested, what the offence you're being charged with is. The officer has to give you the name and their station. And at that point, you just got to comply. If you start struggling or swearing at them, the thing will just escalate and you'll find yourself with the trifecta. you know, resist arrest, assault police, offensive language, on top of whatever else they were going to charge you with in the first place. And they're serious offences. So if the point is you've been arrested, just comply, you know. But ask why. Ask what the offence is, ask what the officer's name is, and ask which station they're from. Right, move along powers. Who's been moved along by the police? Anybody in here? Yep. Okay, so police, we do have a kind of right to be out in public places. There's a kind of right there. And the police have a power, though, to move you on from a public place, but not just if they don't like the look of you. Although, realistically, you know, you talk to First Nations people, they get moved on just because they've got the wrong colour of the skin on the public place. But they're only meant to be able to move you on from a public place if they reasonably believe you're causing or likely to cause harm to others, or they believe you're buying or selling illegal drugs, all right? And then they can say, move on, move away 150 metres from here, and you're not to return for 24 hours. But they can't just do it otherwise. They have to have a valid reason for doing so. But I tell you now, these kinds of powers are regularly used, particularly against First Nations peoples. And when an Aboriginal person comes back after a move on direction, they get arrested, they find themselves in jail, and that's why Aboriginal people are the most incarcerated people on the planet. Protest laws. Do we have a right to protest in New South Wales? What do we think? Does the room think you have a right to protest? Yes, that's a good answer, because we still kind of do. We still kind of do have a right to protest. The police love to make you have to fill out a form before you have a public rally, and give 7 days notice before you have a public rally and stand on the footpath and protest something. You don't have to do any of that. Provided you're not blocking traffic, and you're not on a road and blocking traffic, provided you're in a public place, a park or a footpath, and you're allowing people to get back and forth, you can carry on and protest wherever you bloody like in New South Wales. So just do it. I recommend protesting. It's kind of fun. But there are limits on protest now. And those limits on protest were brought because protest was being very successful. We had the Bentley blockade, we had a series of other protests about WestConnex and other things in Sydney, and together it was starting to challenge the fossil fuel industry, it was starting to challenge private motorways, it was starting to challenge the power of the state. So the current coalition government announced actually to a meeting of the sort of peak mining body in New South Wales, the Minerals Council, that they would bring in laws to limit the right to protest. You know, welcome to New South Wales. We opposed it, Labor opposed it. I hope we're going to change the government and get rid of these crap laws next year. But what are the limits? So, now in addition to whether or not they think an individual is going to cause harm, the police now have a right to basically break up a protest, issue a move-on direction to the whole of a protest and everybody in it if they think that there is a serious risk to safety. What's a serious risk to safety? Pretty much whatever the police think is a serious risk to safety. And the test is, in the opinion of the police officer, there was a serious risk to safety. So it's not an objective test for the judge to work out whether there was or wasn't a serious risk. It's whether or not the police officer's opinion was, and it wasn't an irrational opinion, whether their opinion was there was a reasonable risk to safety. Yes, question? Yep.
Sorry, not really a question. I was just saying that this is why we don't have a right really to protest anymore.
It sure is. This is a serious... They haven't used it yet because it's like the first time they use it, it's going to be one of those litmus tests, serious moment. But they now have the right, if you're out the front of the cop shop in Lismore and you're complaining about a death in custody of a First Nations person, and you've got 60 people on the footpath and you're all getting pretty rowdy and you're pretty emotional and you're pretty pissed off. If the police say, well, do you know what, it was getting out of hand, there were some individuals nearby, some young people or some elderly people, I thought they may have been pushed over, I think there might have been a serious risk to safety, I'm going to shut you down and issue a direction for you to move on, and they can break up the protest. Now that's not a free society in my mind. That is not. Police can now search you if you're going towards a place where they think you might lock on. So if you're riding your bike to a protest and you've got a bike lock on your bike, the police can stop you and search you. We think you're on your way to the protest. If they ask you, are you on your way to the protest? What do you say? I don't wish to answer that question, thank you, officer. I'm just minding my... am I required to answer that question? No, you're not. Well, thanks very much. But if they see you riding a bike towards a protest and you've got a bike lock on it, they can stop you. If they form the opinion that you might use that bike chain to lock on, they can stop you, search you, and actually confiscate your bike lock. They can stop a vehicle and confiscate any chains or anything in the vehicle that you have if you're heading towards a protest. I kind of think that's proof that locking on works in my mind. So in some ways it fills me with despair, but in the other ways it fills me with hope. Those kinds of protests work. They're so effective that the state government passed a law to try and stop it. Yes?
I'm just interested because I'm a backpacker, and if I walk around with my big backpack, I have locks on there. And the question is, if I don't have locks on there, do they control me? And if I have locks on there, they can control me? Is that kind of it, or?
It's not just a padlock normally. It would be, although if you have a big obvious padlock and you're heading towards a protest, they may then use this power on you to actually confiscate your padlock, which would be kind of crap for your backpack if you lose the security on your backpack, but they may well do that. But it's more focused on things like bike chains, things that have got a sort of length attached to them that you may actually viably use to lock on to something. That's more what these laws are focused on. But I say again, they passed the law because this kind of protest works. And in some ways, it's proof positive that our movement is winning. And the last thing I'll do on protest laws is they actually wanted to make it frightening to protest against things like coal mines and coal seam gas operations. They actually wanted to frighten people. And so if you're found to be hindering the operation of a mine, they've now got a maximum penalty of 7 years. And if you think that's just kind of, you know, stopping somebody going in and destroying mining machinery, think again. There's the Woollahra 3, the Woollahra 4, who have been charged because in the little town of Woollahra, which is being in the Hunter Valley, been completely surrounded by coal mines. The town's about to be gobbled up by the last coal mine, and they're trying to fight for their town. They had a protest on a public road leading down towards where the mine operates. They weren't on the mine premises, they weren't on the mine land, they were on a public road a good distance away from the entrance of the mine, but on the road that led to the mine. And because they were blocking the road, the police charged them with this hindering offence. You are hindering the operation of a mine by blocking the public road on the way to the mine, and by making the hindering, in this case, they were alleged to be making, I think the words to the effect of making the road unusable because they were blocking it. Now those, I'd call them brave citizen protesters, are defending this, and they're going to get a judgment on it in the first part of June. But if they go to jail on this kind of serious offence because all they were doing was standing on a road protesting a mine, well, for me, that's indication of a police state. I think they'll beat the charges. I hope they'll beat the charges. But that's currently the state of play in New South Wales. 3 citizens are facing up to 7 years in jail for standing on a road protesting a mine. That'll prove whether or not we have a right to protest. There's these other things about enclosed land. If you enter into enclosed land and you don't leave, with the intent to interfere with a business, you can face a fine of up to $5,500. What's enclosed land? Enclosed land is land that has a fence or an obvious boundary around it. So a school, for example, would be enclosed land because it has a fence or a boundary around it. Some parks are enclosed land if they're fenced and they have a gateway. But I'll give you an example of how these kinds of laws can be directly abused by the police. Early in 2016, when they just passed these laws, there were a group of mainly women, but not entirely women, protesting in a park in the inner west of Sydney, and they were protesting against the West Connects motorways that were being built. And they were in a park, no fence, no enclosed land, they were just in a park, which was partly being gobbled up by a motorway. They weren't very chuffed about that. They thought it was crap that their park was going to be gobbled up by a motorway, and they were protesting about it. And they were protesting about chopping down a whole bunch of trees. Good people, protecting their patch. So what did the police do? Well, the police were brought onto the scene at the direction of the private corporation that runs it, the motorway construction. And then the private corporation built a fence around the protesters. As they were there, they threw up a fence all around them and said, right, now you're on enclosed lands, and if you don't leave, we're going to charge you. And the women said, you're kidding me. You've just made this up. And they said, right, you're not leaving, you're all charged. Good news is, though, they beat those charges. And the magistrate said, that is crap. I'm not going to sign on to that and let them go. But the stress and the anxiety that those women went through, the expense they were put to defeat that, and the obvious politicised way in which these laws are being used. They actually manufactured the charge on the ground. Ugly stuff, ugly stuff. We had a bit of a win 2 years ago on police oversight. There's now, see that name at the top? Law Enforcement Conduct Commission, also called the LEC. You know, lawyers and civil rights type love acronyms. LEC is the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission. That's the independent body that is now been set up to oversight the police in New South Wales. Previously, there were like two different bodies. We had the Ombudsman and the Police Integrity Commission, and things bounced between the two of them, and they never really grappled with holding police to account. And we managed, after years and years of campaigning, to get a single oversight body. It's interesting. The way we got it was the police had actually been acting really badly, not towards Aboriginal people or ordinary citizens, but they'd been actually behaving really badly to each other. And they'd spent a decade and a bit of illegally bugging each other and monstering each other and manufacturing evidence against each other and really badly behaving internally. And it was that misbehaviour that was never checked by any of the previous police oversight bodies that we eventually used as the political vehicle to actually reform police oversight for everybody. So we now have this new body called the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission. And if you've got a serious complaint about police conduct, that's who you take it to. They recently told a parliamentary oversight body that they don't have enough money to do their job. There's a whole lot of stuff they want to do and they can't do because of resources. And they made a direct request for additional resources to the state government, to which the state government said, no. So we have a body. It's genuinely independent, but it has nowhere near enough resources to do what it does. So 95, 96, 97, 98% of complaints that go to the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission are bounced back to the police, and we still have police investigating police for almost every serious incident because they're not resourced to do the job they've been set up to do. But it is a step forward, and it's a better body than we've had before. And I have some hope that we'll get some outcomes from it. But still, 98% of times, if you make a complaint against police, it won't be seen by these guys because they haven't got the resources. It's going to be referred back and we'll have police investigating police like always. And that's the state of play. Lastly, last year there was this great moment where the New South Wales Police Minister and the Premier said, we are going to finally deal with police accountability and we're going to give police body-worn cameras. And you see they've been nicely highlighted there with the circles. And so all police over the next few years will be set with body-worn cameras that will have the capacity to record all the interactions police have with the public. Problem. The police choose when to turn it on and the police choose when to turn it off. Now that's not accountability. In fact, if police are about to behave badly, the first thing they do would be turn off the body camera. And if the police think you're about to behave badly, the first thing they do will turn it on. And as soon as they want to start behaving badly again, they turn it off again. United States jurisdictions where they have body-worn cameras, when the police are in the exercise of their duties in a public place, they are required to have their camera rolling. That's where we should be in New South Wales. Tragically, Victoria is now just rolling out body-worn cameras as well, and they've got the same crap system as New South Wales, where the police choose when to turn them on and when to turn them off. Any questions? Yep.
And wait for the microphone.
Yep.
Where are they? Who wants to talk?
So, before I come to your question, I know that's a lot of information. I think we're having another forum tomorrow where we're talking about policing. It's more about the culture of policing and the politics of policing rather than the nuts and bolts about your rights. I will put this presentation up on my Facebook page, David Shoebridge, my MP Facebook page. So if you want to go back and revisit any of it, it should be up by this afternoon. And of course, I'll be around again at the end of this. But thank you very much for your interest and your engagement. I'll take some more questions. But I want to emphasise, don't volunteer stuff. Don't give away your rights. But don't behave like an idiot either. Because if you behave badly, things can get out of hand and escalate. Know your rights, exercise them with restraint, and wherever you can, record the interactions. Yes?
Am I allowed to take videos all the time if I'm under surveillance myself? If I'm...
if you're being arrested yourself, can you take a video of it? Is that the question?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, it'll be very difficult to do so because the police will be... Once you're arrested, you're subject to the direction of the police. So once you're arrested, the police can say, put the phone down and stop doing that. So realistically, no. Once you've been arrested, it's not going to be viable.
If they pull me over and I do everything fine, give them my driver's license, and they ask me to search my car, I definitely can say no.
Absolutely.
And they say they really want to, and then I can turn on my camera. I said, okay.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a whole lot of camera-related offences if you're in your car. So if you're in the car with the keys in the ignition and you grab your phone, they'll probably charge you with a driving offence related to your phone. But if you've stopped your car, taken your keys out of the car, and you want to record the search, yeah, by all means. If there was that lady who was saying she was stuck in the sun for an hour,
yeah,
they would have been perfectly entitled to be recording that search on their phone while it was happening. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So I've been doing research about the changes in laws since the Commonwealth Games, and I know Queensland's another state, but I've been finding it really hard to find public access to articles about the facial recognition software that's staying on after the Commonwealth Games, and also other, like the drone guns and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So over the next few years, there's a whole nother talk in this. Over the next few years, there are two areas I think that we're going to have a real close look at our civil liberties on. One is facial recognition and biometric analysis, where increasingly police are going to rely upon a building database that just records what we look like, how we move as we move around the place. And at the moment, there's almost no controls on what the police can or can't do with that data. Pretty much every one of our privacy laws carves out the police. So all of our privacy protections are pretty much carved out, and the police can do what they like with our personal data. And personally, I don't feel comfortable about, as I walk around the street, contributing to an ever-growing police database upon me and my family members. So that's an area I think there's almost no laws or rules. There's some internal policies that the police just make up for themselves largely about how that operates. The other area is DNA, and increasingly DNA databases. And there's a national crime DNA database, which is operated by the Commonwealth Government. And that pulls together DNA samples from crime scenes all over the country and allows the police to access, if they've got a DNA sample, to access that database and see if they've got a match. Now, a match is kind of, you understand what it's about. If someone's been at a scene of a crime or they've committed a crime, you can understand how looking for a match, maybe you can balance the civil liberties aspects on that. It's a good crime fighting tool, civil liberties aspects. But what about the fact, if they've got a DNA sample, and they want to check to see if they've got a match on the DNA sample, but they don't actually find a match. But what they do find out is that the sample matches as a cousin of somebody who's on the database. And that's actually what's happening now in the United States. They're having a look, and it's not a match, but this is a cousin or an uncle or a second cousin of such and such a person. And they then use that information to search the cousins and to put all of the cousins under a cloud of suspicion. And any of them who are males aged 25 to 45 suddenly find themselves with the police knocking on their door and saying, "Where were you last Wednesday night? We have reason to believe blah." That's a really kind of dangerous step. Or when they do other DNA analysis and they actually say, "Well, do you know what? It's a Caucasian person with such and such background, with such and all these characteristics," and they then narrow it down to a group of people, and you find yourself the subject of a police investigation, not because of anything you did, but because of your genetic history. They're two really troubling aspects that we're going to have to confront over the next few years. I don't feel politics is well suited to confronting those. I get a sense that all of those powers are going to be handed to police. But I make it my mission as a kind of civil libertarian to identify and flag these issues and try and control them. Yep.
Sorry.
Yep.
Is it on? There you go. From a fellow public worker, I work in the high school system, but there are a whole lot of checks and bounds that we have as educators that, Lord knows, if I was a police officer and performed half of the things I've heard of here, I would have lost my job instantly. Mm-hmm. And there is a whole lot of accountability. And if you think that, you have power behind your phones, again, working in the public system, I've seen kids have phones on a regular basis. They're the first ones with cameras out to film you and obviously hold you accountable, good and bad. But I'm just trying to find my head or wrap my head around the whole system in the sense that, I don't know, there's so much accountability that we already have within our system. I guess I just don't understand why people aren't willing to stand up and do something about it. I don't see where it's a logistical problem. You're saying police policing police. Well, teachers police teachers as well. And there's a whole system behind that. And every single person in Australia has been through a system of education of some sort. I don't see how it's
I'll answer your question. How is it if you've got rules and laws and regulations and evidence that when you present it to the police, and it, on the face of it, shows police acting very badly and abusing their powers, how is it that those police remain police after the complaint? That's your question, I suppose. You know, we've got rules, we've got laws, we're a law-based society. Well, the fact is, police look after each other. There's an inherent conflict of interest when you have police investigating police. And you only have to look at the numbers, you know. Thousands of police complaints of one level or another throughout a year, and you might find 5, 6 or 7 instances where the police are disciplined, and maybe 1 or 2 of those you see the police actually dismissed. And most of the time where police are being disciplined, it's when the complaint was generated by another police officer as opposed to generated by members of the public. The inherent conflict of interest of police investigating police means that what looks like a great system on paper ends up being next to useless when it comes to accountability.
More question?
Yep.
Driving my car and I'm stopped for a saliva swab test. If I am to refuse to give my saliva, what legally happens then?
You will be charged with an offence the equivalent of high-range drink driving. Yep. Yep. So that's the idea being that if you refuse to comply with a breath test, that's what would happen. You get a charge the equivalent of high-range PCI. If you refuse to comply with a swab test, you get a charge the equivalent of high-range prescribed content of alcohol in your system, on the assumption the reason that you're not doing it is because you're going to fail the test in the first place. So, good news though on drug driving. I'll finish with this. I've been a long-time opponent to the way our drug driving laws operate in New South Wales. I don't have a whole lot of friends in Parliament when I oppose it. Most of the Liberal and Labor parties sort of cheer it on. But the idea that you can lose your licence from an oral swab test because you've got a tiny trace element of cannabis because you had a joint the day before or the night before, and you're not impaired with driving. I mean, that is just crap. And we know the reason they're smashing, particularly the North Coast and Southwest Sydney, and that's where you find the big attacks on drug driving and cannabis charges. It's because the police know that the communities who tend to use cannabis aren't politically and socially powerful, and they can smash them, and that's what they do. You're like 30 times more likely to be convicted of a drug driving offence in the Tweed, Byron policing area than you are on the North Shore of Sydney or in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. But if you have a look at the analysis of wastewater that Federal Drug Agency does, they look at the amount of drugs in wastewater. The electorate of Wentworth, you know, where the Prime Minister lives, in eastern suburbs, the amount of cocaine that's found in that wastewater system actually blows the dial. They originally didn't have a rating scale to actually put it on the same graph. Their best estimate is that the seat of Wentworth goes through about 1 kilo to 1.5 kilos of cocaine every weekend. So we have been running a campaign that says, well, why are you doing this socially targeted war on cannabis, which isn't really about drug driving, and you're letting your mates off in the good seat of Wentworth and North Sydney who are zonked to the eyeballs on cocaine and just been waved through all of these tests. You know, we know it's not safe. If it's not safe to drive with cannabis, tell me why it's safe to drive with cocaine. Anyhow, we've been running that campaign for 2 years. Initially, the roads minister said that the reason they didn't test for cocaine was because it's not detectable after 6 minutes after it's consumed. He actually said that in Parliament. I was tempted to ask him, where do your friends get their cocaine from? But I didn't. I said, well, I'm not an expert, but I think 6 minutes is a bit silly. Anyhow, it turns out it can be detected for up to 24 hours after it's been consumed. That's the truth on cannabis, on cocaine. Cannabis maybe a week or 2 weeks. And we've been saying and running that political campaign. You're letting your mates off, your well-collected mates off, you're not testing for cocaine, you're only testing for really cannabis and meth and MDMA because you know you don't want to catch your mates and well-connected, well-heeled lot with cocaine. That's been really effective, I might say, in embarrassing the government. And just on Wednesday, the government was forced to change the laws to actually include cocaine on the roadside drug testing. That's going to happen from 1 July. And once we start getting the sons and daughters of bankers and lawyers and politicians, maybe we'll start getting the political incentive to actually change these dumb laws. Anyhow, it's been lovely talking. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David.